Anyone who is watching from afar, welcome. Can I call on Councillor Epiha to open us with a karakia, please? Here.
Slight delay.
A delayed echo. Okay. There are no apologies. We're all present. Conflicts of interest. No new conflicts of interest. Confirmation of minutes of the previous meeting on the 9th of June. Are there any corrections? Moved Councillor Gallagher, seconded the Mayor. All those in favour, contrary carried.
Mr. Chair, I just had a question.
Yes.
It was a point raised by Councillor Miller around performance of the community board, and I see that it hasn't been put into the next report, or is that to come?
Can you page number?
Well, it's not in the
minutes.
It's not in the minutes. Councillor Miller raised a question around seeking a performance review. Hasn't been captured, and I just wanted to know if that was something that's going to be addressed.
That would be a matter that would be directed back to the chair of the community board.
Yes.
Which I'm happy to take back on behalf of this committee, but I would think it would be more directed by council rather than the subcommittee if that was to be an issue.
Mr. Chair, the issue I was raising was, as a group, if we were to make a decision on the futures of community boards and not having one in my own board, it would be wise for us to have some sort of input as to the efficiency and performance of the existing board that we have before we make decisions recommending or otherwise to a wider community. The struggle that we're going to find by pointing the arrow back at the chair or even the Melbourne Community Board is the same arrow that's facing us. Assessing your own performance and creating a new structure. So if it was to be done, it'd be better performed by an independent third party.
And as I noted before, I think if that was an issue, it would be discussed at full council in the first instance, and possibly wouldn't be just as narrow as one particular committee of council.
Thank you. But I think, unfortunately, given the time frame of our work ahead of us, there isn't the time frame left. Today, we will be adopting what we're going to put out for our preliminary consultation. At the end of that, in August, we will be adopting what will go out for the formal consultation. And I don't think within that time frame there is the ability to have an independent assessment of the performance of a community board to feed back into the process. Today's recommendations and the discussion later in the meeting will be on what community board options we want to go out with this preliminary consultation, and I look forward to that. So we have a mover and a seconder for the minutes. All those in favour? Contrary carried. I have no chairman's report today, so we'll move on to item number 7, page 8, delegation to community boards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll just refer to some of the highlights in here. This recommendation is simply that we receive this report for information. You might recall at the last meeting of the subcommittee, I talked about delegation models and processes. So the purpose of this paper is just to alert the subcommittee that there will be a requirement on council if we were to pursue community boards to identify delegations to its community boards. I've given the statutory reference, which is 52 of the LGA, and there's a couple of principal things there that we look at. The first one is for a community board to represent and act as advocate for its community, and I think the other key one is number E, which is communicate with community organisations and special interest groups in any community. There are certain things that community boards cannot do, which is acquiring, holding or disposal of property. Any staff-related matters, rates, bylaws are outside the power of community boards. And paper just reminds us of the delegations to the Melbourne Community Board, which were made immediately following the 2019 elections. And again, this is a statutory process. But I've highlighted on the bottom of page 10, top of page 11 of the agenda, that the following delegations were to the board. So it's long-term and annual planning processes. Top of the next page, making recommendations on funding priorities for local projects, but eroding stuff. RMA, bearing in mind, of course, that will be changing over the next 12 to 24 months. Civil defence, community development, which is really the key one. And in the case of Melbourne, there is a sister city arrangement that's there as well. And as I've noted in my second to last paragraph, it'll be incumbent on council to consider the degrees of delegation if it's to go down the community board model. But that's just for information, Mr. Chair. Happy to answer any questions, but more importantly, just a reminder to the subcommittee and to council that if you're following the community board route, you then need to do the delegation model as well, so that the boards understand what their purpose in life is.
Tēnā tātou. Thank you, David. Is there any delegations that a community board has within their power that is any different to a community committee?
Mr. Chair, community boards are have statutory responsibilities where community committees do not. Yeah, so it's linkage back to the Act chain.
Thank you.
It's also, they have, because they're not part of council and their role is to represent the interests of their communities, they have, in my view, much wider powers than a community committee of council will have. They can make submissions on anything they can tie that back to. When I was a community board member, we submitted on the district plan, the regional plan, even as far as submitting on RMA changes, and spoke at a select committee. So it's the broadest power that a community board has is anything that it chooses to represent its committee in. So it is actually much broader and stronger than a council committee or a community committee, and they have a bit more resourcing than a community committee.
Yeah, I guess that sort of comes back to my question and understanding that it's the historical forward. Yeah. The movement we're seeing moving forward, making it consistent with community committees throughout our review. That's why I asked that.
Yeah, and we can't confuse the two at this stage because, as I say, one's a statutory responsibility and the other one is a decision of council that will follow through into a different time frame.
And under the powers, I think clause F, 3F, where to undertake any other responsibilities that are delegated to it by the territorial authority, council here has been reluctant to delegate to community boards because there hasn't been a community board in each ward. If there was a community board in each ward, then council might choose to be give more oversight, direct powers to the community board that it currently holds to itself. But that will be incumbent on the incoming council and the number of community boards. So it's very hard to define who was first, Grant or Steve.
Grant.
Seeking clarity from the chair as to the reason for this report. I suppose it's noted for information. Are you asking us to consider adding delegations or removing delegations, or just hearing what's currently there?
If I can answer initially, that latter part is outside the scope of the subcommittee. The reason for the report was simply to remind the process that we would have to follow if indeed community boards were considered to be an option. But the process you're talking about, Grant, can only be established by council.
I just wanted clarity on what you're wanting from us today.
No, it's just FYI stuff.
So all I'm noting is under section 3, A to F, if you look at all those bullet points, they're basically the role of a councillor.
Yes. And add to that, Grant, go back to section 5, which identifies those delegations that council gave to the Melbourne Community Board in early November 2019.
I guess the questions around board performance or delegations and other things they're important things to consider, but for this subcommittee, I think our main focus is to think about what shape looks good for an election, and listening to community feedback around, does the community want a community board, and does the community want to fund a community board, and which communities would like that. And because we've got one ward with a community board, it's a lot of that conversation. I think just for my own thinking, I'm often thinking about the Melbourne Community Board because they're in existence, but actually this is a decision about whether or not there's community boards in all of our wards. But I don't think about that as often because they're not currently there. But that's not to say our community wouldn't ask for them, or some within each of those communities might not get some feedback on this. So I'm feeling like this meeting is going to be angling us towards some preliminary options to put to the community, and then await feedback from them to make the decision, rather than thinking the details of these next two reports. But I appreciate that they're here, but we're not going to change that today, because this is for beyond the next election, I would have thought, for these things.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to support the comments that you had made back to Councillor Chain, to say that I endorsed those and agreed, and probably in the simplest term, the community board sits here with a unique situation that it's an independent body, which no community committee has that degree of independence, so it has the ability, that's the board, to submit or make comments contrary to some of the views that council might be making. And then the other comments, because we're having a general discussion to Councillor Miller, that performance is probably going to be judged by the community, isn't it, as to whether it values the investment they're making of whatever that number is, but call it $50 a property, as to whether they see they're getting value out of the representation. That's probably the true test of the performance. And you know, as we look at history, where council decided to or recommended to discontinue the community board, and then the board was able to collect over 1,000 signatures, which basically made the compelling question to the commission for it to continue. So I think that's probably, but I agree with everything the chair's just said.
Probably my comments might more relate to the report on the options for preliminary consultation. I'll not wait till then. Thanks.
The one comment I would make in response to your earlier comments, Councillor Miller, is that because it is an independent body, a community board can hold council to account sometimes a little bit more than a councillor can. A councillor is often bound by collective responsibility. Once council's made a decision, they should be bound to support that, whereas a community board doesn't have that restriction. They can hold council to account on behalf of their community more than perhaps any individual councillor can. The councillor can work behind the scenes, but collective responsibility binds them to the council's decision. The community board is able to critique council process on behalf of its community in an independent fashion. So they do have their advantages. So that's how I will finish my comments. If anybody else has any more comments, Jenny, you any comment on this? Would someone like to move that we receive the report? John, seconded. Shane, all those in favour? Contrary, carried. We move to the report for indicative operating budgets, page 12.
So again, take this as read, just pointing out that the report is based on current operating costs and recovery model for Melbourne Community Board. It's premised on the assumption that there are 5 elected members and they've got similar degrees of delegation to the Melbourne Community Board. So round numbers, the cost is 149,829 to be precise. So round numbers, 150,000 is the operating cost for community board. 2 significant items, which are elected member remuneration, which is dictated by Remuneration Authority, and council staff support, which is a whole myriad of things right across some disciplines I've identified in the report. Currently in the Melbourne ward, there is a targeted rate of $44 per rateable property, and depending on the cost, assigned to the community board and or the delegations, then that will vary for other wards if we were to pursue it. But again, this is for information, bearing in mind that if we are going to pursue community boards, there is a cost attached to that, which through consultation the community will need to be aware of.
I had a question for you, David, on this one. If a final option included a significant portion of the West Melton area in a new Malvern ward and perhaps a new subdivision for the community board, would it be reasonable to suggest that the members' remuneration would increase by, if there were say 2 members, about 40%, but not necessarily the council support costs? So it's not quite add 50% of the board, add 50% of the costs, it's more members' remuneration.
Well, I think they both do it. If there is a wider ward area with wider delegations and staff costs would certainly increase. As to the remuneration, that would depend on how the remuneration authorities see those responsibilities and the area of coverage and number of constituents that people are responsible for.
Thank you. Any Shane?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The operation amount of 14829, where does that come from? And if the community board is disbanded, where does it go back to?
It's purely funded from a targeted rate, Shane, at the moment. So that targeted rate of $44 across the Melbourne ward would cease. Yep.
John?
Just for information to remind this group, and I'm sure they're aware that there was a deficit in the community board's account. Correct me if I'm not wrong, Mr. Chief Executive. We increased the rate at this last annual budget process so that debt would in fact be cleared. That's right, isn't it, David?
Yep, to the tune of 20 grand, John.
Yep.
Round numbers.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, would someone like to move that we receive the report? The Mayor and Jenny. All those in favour? Contrary carried. Representation review, options for preliminary consultation, page 14. Stephen Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The report on the options for preliminary consultation, I guess, wraps together the discussions that the subcommittee has had over its last couple of meetings, which have been very productive in terms of refining the options that you have been looking at and bringing them down to a selection of options that you feel are acceptable to take out to the community for this initial stage of consultation. So just as a reminder, this initial stage is preliminary. It's not a formal statutorily required phase of consultation, but it is encouraged under the Local Government Commission guidelines, and it's been followed by most councils that have gone through this process, and indeed Selwyn has used this preliminary consultation stage in the past before as well. And in fact, in 2015, we also went out with 4 options for preliminary consultation. So these are to gauge feedback from the community as to their views of the range of options that have been put up for consultation, which will then come back to this committee in August following the consultation period. At that point, the subcommittee will make its recommendation, having heard submissions, or not having heard submissions, having analysed the feedback from the community and to determine an initial proposal, too many terminologies here, to determine the initial proposal to go out for the formal consultation stage, which is further down the track. So that would come back to this committee in August. It would make its recommendation to the council, and the council will adopt the initial proposal to go out for consultation. So to come back to the options that we have today, we've put the 4 options. There are 2 4-ward options and 2 3-ward options, which you'll be familiar with in terms of the numbers that we have worked through. We've presented them in map format so that they can hopefully be readily seen. We may make some tweaks just for readability to those maps, and they will be available both in paper and online versions. And for each of those options in the consultation material that you see, we've also included the options for inclusion or not inclusion of community boards, as was discussed at our last meeting as well. So that gives quite a wide range of options. People can look at, first of all, the ward boundaries and the number of elected members, but they can also consider and think about the role of community boards under each of those options. So in one sense, the way the material is presented at the moment, there are, I guess, 8 options. There are the 4 primary options, and then a with community board and without community board option under each of the 4 as well. So attached to this is our initial draft of the consultation material, which sets out the background to the representation review, the reasons why the representation review is necessary, referring to the plus and minus 10% rule, and the notes around fair and effective representation. There's explanation of the options that are being considered so that we can meet those requirements for meeting the numerical requirements plus the fair and effective representation, and some discussion about how those would play out in any future scenarios. This material about the role of community boards, which attempts to give at least an introductory flavour of the role that community boards could play were they to be adopted across all or any of the options that are presented. And there's a summary of the proposed activity that we're looking at undertaking during July, so the dates for the representation and the activity that we will undertake. On page 17, we outline the consultation will be carried out through our usual online engagement platform. We'll also make printed information and feedback forms, and that will include the maps at our usual outlets. We are looking at public meetings or drop-in sessions, and be happy to have some discussion around those. A minimum of 1 per existing ward, with the proposal also to hold 1 in West Melton, as that is potentially one of the more significantly affected areas, and a workshop with the Melbourne Community Board. And we'll be promoting and directing people to that information through the usual range of channels, both through traditional media and digital and social media as well. So the appendix from page 18 through to the end of the maps which are presented really takes you through the material, as I mentioned, setting out the background, the rationale, and the options that are there for consideration. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Happy to open for discussion.
Q members, questions? Sam?
Yeah, I'd say great. Good to see on the maps where we're at. I think it's really clear to present to the community what the options look like and what the district would look like and the wards, where the ward boundaries sit. I do wonder, just in 3 wards, 10 councillors, and 3 wards, 9 councillors, we had talked last meeting about shifting the piece right by the Rakai River. There's 40 people, I think, that live in there. The little green sliver that's on, appears to be sort of on the wrong side of the state highway, rather than following the state highway line down. If that was to move to the other side, I don't know if we're changing boundaries. And both option 2 and option 3, there's that little green slither that's on the eastern side of the state highway, and for everything else it's kind of lined up differently. I think there's 40 people there. Whether or not that makes much difference, but just looking at the map, it then follows more of a line that is understood on the ground. I'm interested to hear what the community has to say on these, and think that asking the community sort of a blank question, because this is a chance to reset, and we're looking at what the wards look like. There's change, there's no status quo option, they're all changed, so it's all a chance to have, from a beginning, first principles conversation with the community. We have to have some representation. We're starting with thinking about where we've come from, but there's an opportunity to do things differently going forward. Which one of these do you like? And tell us if you want a community board, and we'll hear back. So yeah, looking forward to what the community's going to say, and I think we're going to engage the community more in the conversation if we start with a no community board. Ask them to tell us that they want a community board, rather than ask them to tell us that they want to split or want to get rid of it. I just think that way you engage more of the community in the conversation. But I don't know that we need to go down to that level of detail with this conversation now, because we're really just putting out these 4, and It could actually be just a general question around community boards. Do
What?
you want it? Do you not?
Okay. So just to tease it out, so I guess the question regarding the sliver is where's the mesh block? Do you end up with a bigger piece if you put that piece into the Springs Ellesmere ward? Do you end up with a bigger piece north of the highway crossing? Murray and Stephen can perhaps address that in a minute. My question to you would be with respect to the community board options. So you would support a no community board option in all 4 options rather than the 2 sub options in each.
Yeah, I just think we've
Consultation.
got 4 maps. They show the 4 ward spaces, and the question about community boards is tell us if you want one. We don't have to say we prefer or don't prefer at this stage. We're saying we've got 4 options for cutting things up, and then we'll hear back.
Can I tease that out a little bit more? Because I think one of the 4 options definitely is enhanced with the option of community boards, which is option 4 wards with 7 representatives.
Yeah.
Because I think without a not community option in that consultation, our community might be concerned about the perceived low level of representation.
Maybe, but equally, but equally, I'd say that this Ellesmere ward might say the same because they are down on councillors and representation there too. So I wouldn't want to preemptively cut off the opportunity for people to tell us whether or not they want a community board. And I think if we go out a bit blank on that one and actually just ask a question for feedback in the preliminary phase, I know we're going to have to make a decision when we get to the formal consultation. I think we might hear a greater range of people engaging in it. But I think it's 1 mesh block too along there. But Murray, if I don't know if you've got the data there, just from the last maps we had, I think it's 1 mesh block and the boundary is the state highway.
Right. Okay, Shane?
Yeah, you've already asked my question actually. Mark will answer my question around fair representation. That's my concern for reducing councillors. First thing constituents have already said to me is that where we're going to get a representation from. So while I agree with Sam and putting the options out there first, listen to the community, I think we need to have that option there to give them some sense of security moving forward. So I would actually put that as an option.
So you support community boards in all the 4 options, or just 4, 7?
That's definitely an option. Part of the consultation. There is concern out there already around representation.
John?
Sorry, isn't Shane's view, if you could just explain yours, as a contrary view to what Sam has just said?
Yes.
Which means that isn't Sam's question asked the same way? Or because if you ask no boards, well then you're going to vote yes or no, but yours I suppose is the other way. So I'm going to have 4 boards, tell us why you don't want them. You've got to ask each of those questions to get the answer. Stephen's probably the best judge of comment.
That's okay. But we'll come back to that, Stephen. Grant?
First of all, thanks for the maps. These are much better than looking at mesh blocks. Why didn't we start with these? Look, I support the mayor. Consultation needs to be as easy as possible for people to understand. We've got 4 options, 1, 2, 3, 4. Like people can work, but you've got having the sub options underneath is like filling out a lotto ticket, because you got and some of them are presupposing. You've got 4 wards with 4 community boards. What if you want 4 wards with 1 or 2 or 3? So already our consultation document is presupposing what some of them might be. You're not giving all optionality. So I'd support where Sam's coming from. I think it's more of a, we have the existing 1 community board. Would you like that to continue? And there's an option of creating more community boards if you wish. It's a clear section that everyone can go to and look at and go, yep, this is a community boards. I can understand that. And referencing what I said earlier and Shane brought up, how is anyone outside of Melbourne going to have any idea of the value of a community board if there's not some sort of feedback or from the community or from somewhere saying, well, this has been an effective tool in the past? Because I think part of our representation review, we must also acknowledge that we are doing a community committee restructure. So a large portion of the workload of the Melbourne Community Board of going to visit hall committees and reserve committees will no longer be there. And so people in Melbourne may not know that their local community board, which spends a lot of their time going to meetings every night, those meetings will not longer be there. So where do they find that piece of information out? They also need to know that our community services manager has proposed a network of, I think it's 8 community committees, which could volunteer community committees, which are going to, in essence, be a voluntary community board in some respects. So how do they find that piece of information out? That could be vital to this whole conversation, because if they're aware of what the future looks like, or potentially looks like, it may alter their voting style, because at the moment they're suffering a lack of information, I think. So.
Do you have a view of whether, what's your view on this report, particularly with respect to the options of either having no recommendation with respect to community boards or the 2 recommendations per option? What's your view?
I actually agree with Grant's comments. So we just need to let people know, if they don't know, that we're losing those committees. Yeah, I'm not sure how you go about it, but you don't want to bamboozle them with too many questions. I agree with that.
It is unfortunate, but there is nothing we can do about that the restructuring of community committees is happening at the same time. And the restructuring of community committees has not been cemented into the actual how it will function and how the community can understand that. And I listened to what Grant was saying, and I understand, and I have a lot of support for that comment. So we've got confusion there. And when I looked at the groups, particularly the size of the groups of communities in Melbourne, they were a bit like 2 small community boards, covering a large area, and even bringing those together for them to see value in is going to be quite difficult. But we're not here today to discuss that. That's another side. But it is part of the discussion or the understanding for people when they vote. Could I ask Stephen, please, these maps, which are grey, and people's engagement is often short-lived and they only read, whether there would be an advantage on the right-hand side beside each of those boxes to indicate the number of councillors on that map. So they see it instantly when they look at the map, just so that, because I think we all know people speed read, they glance at the impact. And I would also agree with Grant, I compliment you on the maps. It is very clear now when you study that the option 1 and the option 2, that you have created, I beg your pardon, no, in option 2 particularly, with the 3 wards, which I was never that quite keen on, it really establishes one ward, particularly Melbourne, as being a traditional cell and rural ward, doesn't it? Whereas option 1, when it includes the population of West Melton, sort of throws that a wee bit. Now, that doesn't necessarily, that's not a negative, because a representative that is representing your community should have their knowledge, or at least be involved in some sort of urban community. Admittedly, it's got Darfield, but I compliment you on the maps. I'd like to see, without repeating myself, the number of councillors just there to the right, so that when I read each option, I fully understand what it is.
But John, that certainly be a title on each map. There's a grey area at the top of each map. If that grey area had 3 wards, 10 councillors in that area, just as a title, would make it clear. Could be quite large print, and would, even if it said option 1, 4 wards, 10 councillors across that top area, as well as in the table of contents, it would make it clear and very visible to the reader. I support that. I have waited to come and to discuss this because I came back to, if we look at page 18, what is the representation review? And the purpose of the representation review, I probably sit whether I'd rather see the options with respect to the community boards in this initial consultation, because of one of the things we have to consider is effective representation of community's interest. And as we reduce the number of potentially reduce the number of councillors and change the size and nature of the wards, that effective representation changes. And personally, I think it is more engaging to give them 2 sub-options, community boards or not, should provoke a yes or no more than an option that simply says none. You have to ask if you want one, which the default option is none, and I think that would be the response we get. Whereas if we say you have two options, none or one, for most of the wards, that provokes a comment, a more definite, I like 0 or 1 for my ward, rather than, oh, I don't have to consider it. Whether our consultation documentation adequately describes the role of a community board is another question. But I think that personally, I feel that it would engage the community more if they had to positively choose one of the two sub options rather than it not being there. I'd rather know a more definitive answer from them, particularly in a combined Springs Ellesmere ward, which will have a reduction in number of councillors, whether they feel that having a community board with stronger powers than community committees would, than the 8 committees that were referred to earlier, would be a better way of having representation for them. Or they can say, no, we've tried community boards historically, we didn't like it, it didn't work, we don't want one. So that's where I sit. But perhaps we'll now let Stephen and Murray answer the questions before we come back to considering it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Murray might have some comments as well, but I'll just start off a couple of the points that have been raised. The question was raised about, can we, I guess, at least raise the possibility of the future local community committees? It may be possible as part of the consultation material to include a sidebar story that, you know, the council is currently reviewing its community committee structure, which may result in XYZ in the future. So at least we're alerting the community to the fact that that may happen, and that may provide a structure of local volunteer community committees. So at least the information is in front of them. So we'd be certainly able to look at that. Certainly able to look at the title. The discussion around whether to include the full questions about the community boards or not was really interesting, because it almost exactly mirrored the discussion that Murray and I had around the whiteboard when we were working through the same question of how do you present that range of options. But really, I think that the choice is either the way it is presented here, or the other suggestion, I guess, would be in the form of here are the 4 options. Select the favourite of your 4 options. So we ask them to indicate which their favourite of the 4 options is, and then a subsequent question: for your preferred option, would you prefer to have community boards or no community boards? So that would be a way of presenting that option. Happy to take advice. I don't know, Murray, if you've got any other thoughts on that.
Probably not really, to be honest. I think that pretty much sums it up. It's whether you do it as we have now, or have as a separate community board conversation as part of that consultation document, as part of the pre-consultation document, so you get people to think clearly about the board after they've looked at the governance structure. So there are different ways you can look at that.
Thank you. And the question regarding the mesh block around the southern portion of State Highway 1 to the Rakaia River.
I mean, I'd have to recheck the numbers, but I'm pretty sure we can accommodate it's 40 in there. Pretty sure that can be accommodated in there. So if the committee was comfortable with that, we can adjust that to pick up that slither. And just to be clear, that's in the 310 and the 39. That's correct. Yeah. That can be done.
Okay, that's great. I think that addresses that concern of yours, Sam.
Yep.
Who has?
Can I say yes?
Yep.
Yep. So it's around our number of people that we each represent. We're far overrepresented as a community compared to many in New Zealand, where we represent far fewer people per councillor than many others. But we also are underrepresented compared to some councils where they have far less people than we do as well. So there is a bit of there's a spectrum there around where we sit. But I'm not really worried about a lack of representation for our community with 7 9 or 10 councillors as the option. I don't think that's the key piece for me. And I agree with what Stephen has said. Let's ask the question around the structure, but then the question shouldn't be, do you want to have a community board in someone else's ward? The question is, do you want a community board in your ward, in my ward? So they choose 1, 2, 3 or 4. The next question is, do you want a community board in your ward? Do you know what ward you live in? Name your ward. And with a little bit of explanation. It's going to cost you $50. And there's some extra delegations that council might give to them. And to just break the question down and make it as easy for people. But I don't think we want people in Lincoln telling us whether there should be a Melbourne Community Board, and we don't want people in Springfield saying that Selwyn Central should have a community board either. It's really about, do you want one for yourself, and to feel like you can have a good representation of your views in the governance structure of Selwyn going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Sam, for those comments, because I was going to bring that up too. We want to know what wards want community boards, not people voting throughout the whole district for a ward that they don't live in. So thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just note, Stephen, you used the word community may be restructured, community committees. I would suggest that that is a fait accompli, and the word's not may, it is, because it was approved at the last council meeting, as I understand.
Yeah, I think it was that the council is reviewing its committee structure.
And it has agreed on some things which it has voted on, so
we'll
may doesn't come in with it, does it? The other thing is just interesting, when people vote on their options, is there any support for preferential voting?
Good question. We had in this draft, we had actually suggested that we might ask people to indicate their top 2 preferences, like to give a 1 and 2, just so we can see a bit of the spread of where people's views are at, and be interested in the committee's thoughts on whether that is helpful or not. We can certainly just go out with which is your preferred option, but would be interesting to perhaps test. I don't think we go to a full sort of STV model, but it might be interesting to see if there's a view as to whether that provides a bit of a layer of richness of data for us.
My other comment or question is that, which you obviously thought about, and I think we've all thought about, and if you try to imagine yourself to be just a member of the community, not connected to this committee, or maybe you're an elected member, or maybe you have history, because you obviously have a lot more knowledge, you cannot get away from the fact, when you look at option 4, which gives the Melbourne ward 1 councillor, as I understand it, you would have naturally have quite a lot of support for a community board, because you would see thinning down very much of your representation. But it might be when you looked at option 1 and 2, which still retains 2 councillors for your ward, that you might have a slightly different view. And I'm not sure how you collect those views. It becomes quite grey, doesn't it?
Yeah. See if the community do that.
Start to agree with you, Sam, that may be the best option. We want this thing to be, when they read it and react, to be supporting grant relatively simple to understand and read, and then for apply.
I wonder if we're talking about having a question regarding the wards and number of councillors, and potentially collecting first and second preference. Noting what you said, John, that we also then have the community board question as first and second preference, because those who choose, someone might choose a 3-9 option, but also the 4-7, and the answer with respect to community boards might be different under the 2 options, because if 4-7 is the option, they might want a community board, but under 3-9 they might not. Is that compromise that allows the collection of the best information to help us when we come to make our final recommendation. Right.
My answer to you, Mr. Chairman, is clearly no. What you're going to end up with after that consultation is 28%, 28%, 28%, 28%. We've got to start weighing it down into a narrower funnel, otherwise we're never going to get anywhere. You know, I think Sam's proposal is very good, that you choose the option that suits you best. Once you've decided that option, you then go into a secondary question: which ward am I in? Do I want a community board? I think that has a lot more rationality about. That's my own view.
So just for clarity, you wouldn't seek a first and second preference on the number of wards?
I don't think so. I think we've done the work to get down to 4. We're now asking our community to give us some direction on which of those 4 they approve, because I think you're going to inevitably, if you start getting to option 2, you really are going to start. We'll have no direction.
Look, I think we just remind ourselves that we've done some very, very good work getting down to 4 options. We're ready to go out with consultation. Stephen's written a very good consultation document, which has just got one gap, which is around public meetings. But the advice I'd give you is don't complicate it. You know, put the information out to the community and let the community have their say, which is what we want. With respect to the public meetings on page 24, and Mr. Chair, you talked about this initially, public meetings, if you're going to do that, it's date, time, place. Remind ourselves that we had clinics for the LTP, incredibly successful in terms of the number of people that we engaged with, and victims of our own success, we got 640 odd submissions back, you know, against an average of 230. So we gave the right message, we were visible, we answered, and we encouraged people to participate.
Sorry, do members on that issue, subject to the dates being confirmed, support a drop-in clinic over a more formal meeting with the community?
Definitely a drop-in rather than a big show. Yeah.
Thank you. And I've suggested that a separate meeting for West Melton, because in all these options, they are the area both around the township and the more rural area around the township that have the most significant changes, and felt that they deserve an opportunity to have those discussed in their context rather than a wider ward context, because while the merger of Springs and Ellesmere is significant, they still retain a lot of the structure, whereas a lot of the West Melton area may be shifting wards, and they may want to have a more targeted discussion around the options and the impact there. Stephen, I do have a comment that a Rolleston meeting could also be held at the community centre. There is a slot on the 3rd Monday of the month, currently booked for the Rolleston Reserve Management Committee, who are not meeting. So that evening is actually available for a meeting, because I wonder, in this ward, sometimes it's a bit more daunting to come here for a consultation than go to the community centre. So that time slot is available on the 3rd Monday, the 19th of July, in the early evening, for a drop in there, because that may be a more user-friendly venue than the council chamber.
Why don't we go to where the people are, the Selwyn Indoor Sports Centre and the swimming pool? I mean, that's where you're going to get people who tell you stuff. I mean, even the supermarket's a great place to stand. And Foster Library, yeah.
Well, it's how many we want to have. Certainly, if we wanted to target one meeting in Rolleston, then yes, perhaps an evening in one of the rooms at the sports centre might be a better target. It's what we could look for in the Springs ward, Grant. Where would you see this? Lincoln Event Centre or
Lincoln Library worked really well last time.
Right.
Yeah, seemed to be good. Or the market, but the market probably wasn't as successful. But, yeah. Tim?
Yep. I think we best not underestimate the amount of information that our public know and how much they might already have a view around some answers here. So I think it's really great the background that's here, but for most people, if we were to ask them 3 questions, what is your preferred map? What ward will you end up in? And do you want a community board for that ward? Is there any more than that we need? Because to me that would answer every question that I'm going to need feedback on for the next piece. That means that my interaction at the sports centre or at the library can be really quick. I'm not chewing up more and more of people's time to think about, and will give me a really great sense of I'm not interrupting. I'm not looking for someone to come spend half an hour somewhere to tell me something that they probably think council should have determined anyway. And so when I interrupt them, it's a short piece. So while I like all the information that's here for those that want to read it, I think that most people will be able to answer those 3 questions if I were to walk outside now and just ask them. And let's get that interaction going as quickly as we can. If there's more than those 3 questions that the committee members would like to see, then let's have that laid out now so that we give staff the direction. But you know, a 10-page document to answer 3 questions, I think is a bit overkill.
John.
Just talking about the engagement, and obviously we had a discussion prior to the meeting, and Stephen asked a question or expressed a view. Could it in fact be a bit of 2 ways? One, there'd be a little bit of a presentation, and then there'd be an opportunity to break out. Rolleston might have the advantage. It has a sports centre, it has a swimming pool. If I represent my ward, we don't have those natural type high movement of people going through. And if I read my ward, it's probably slightly more traditional, and they might respond to more of a style that Stephen has suggested than maybe in another ward.
Thank you. I think that we should bear that feedback in mind and tailor the consultation in each ward and each place to suit the communities. You're right that Malvern are, and potentially, I suspect, Ellesmere, Shane, may be a little more traditional in the style that they prefer to meet. But we can, perhaps Stephen can come back to us with after the meeting, with perhaps an email to the members suggesting the meetings and formats for us to agree to, because it would be very helpful for the ward councillors to be there. I would intend to be, if possible, be at all of them as committee chair, but it would be helpful. I think, Sam, that some people will want more information than just a map and 3 questions. There are some people who want to give it a little bit more consideration than just that, because it is a significant question, and we are, in all of these options, proposing a change. There's at least 1 fewer councillor and ward boundary changes. So some it will be very simple, yes, 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 done. Others may want to have a longer think think about how it will work, because if you're in the rural area and what's currently Selwyn Central by the Waimakariri River, will you notice if you actually go to the Melbourne Water? Maybe they won't. But they'll still interact with the same people and in the same way, just the rating structure might be a little bit different. So I wouldn't underestimate people wanting to engage a little bit more fully, but I think you're right. The fundamental thing is 3 questions, but it's, we need to be prepared for those who want a bit more discussion. Any other comments?
Mr. Chairman, perhaps if I could suggest that the answer is not an either or one, it's a both and. And I think if we follow good consultation principles, similarly to what we've done with LTP, I think my recommendation would be that we, as the base consultation, run the 5 drop-in sessions that we proposed, 1 per ward and 1 in West Melton. And in addition to that, we can make packs of information and maps and things available to you as members of the committee that you can take out to what we would call pop-up events. And if you want to stand outside the supermarket on a Sunday morning, John, in Darfield and have those conversations, or at any other location, sports centre, pool, wherever, then we can make that information available, and you can engage with your communities, and we'll provide what support we can through the provision of information and helping to set those up and promote and advertise them if we wish to do that.
Thank you. Jay?
Can I just suggest that those packs also gets into the committee chairs as well, so that they can have that appropriate a conversation as well. As Bob said, rural areas have a bit of geography between them, so it's really important to wrap those conversations up in fair representation from councillors through that as well.
Mine is a similar request. I presume that same pack would be available electronically. I could go on to the council website we could indicate to those existing community groups or committees or whatever it is that, you know, is available or whatever it is, and so that they could pass that connection on to their database, and they could, you know, be able to have a look. And as we get more and more engagement, people are happy to engage electronically or by their laptop or their computer.
Yes, all that material will be on our online engagement platform, and we'll promote that widely, and you can share that on through your networks as well.
Thank you. I think looking at the recommendation we have in front of us, I think with a little bit of rewording on B should perhaps that the committee confirms the 4 options with a separate community board question.
Yeah.
For the basis, as the basis for the preliminary consultation. Does that meet what I think I've heard us discuss?
Mr. Chair, if I may, I think to just further clarify that would mean that we would remove the text relating to the community board options from the document.
Yes, that's the intention of the committee, that it simply be a separate question once you've gone through which of the maps you like.
Yeah.
Do you want a community board in the ward, in the structure that you've chosen?
The ward that you would live in under that. Yep.
But for clarity, identifying that there will be a cost associated with that.
Yes, there will still be the information about the role and the potential costs of community boards.
Got it.
It's just a specific paragraph about the community board option and what that looked like under each of our 4 scenarios we would remove.
Yes.
Oh, and could we confirm that we are just asking for your preferred option, not first and second option?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that was the same.
I think that's the indication the committee have given. Okay, if that's so, would someone like, I'll move the recommendations in front of us on this one. Someone like to second it? Councillor Gallagher. Is there any further discussion? If not, those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, carried. Thank you. Our next report is our timetable, I think. There is one item to discuss on that. Thank you, Councillor Miller and Councillor Epiar, for moving and seconding. I don't think we're going to need a meeting, our currently timetabled July meeting in the middle of the consultation period. I don't think we have anything to do on that meeting. So I think we can agree now that our next meeting will be the 11th of August. And if Stephen and Murray are able to pre-circulate the results of the consultation for us, that would be helpful. The 11th of August, we would be intending to come back and determine our final initial proposal to recommend to Council for Council to adopt on the 25th of August.
Mr. Chairman, just one other item in relation to this. You'll see we noted that as part of the process, as the subcommittee indicated, we would do a briefing for the full council, and there is a paper for information attached to this afternoon's council meeting agenda. So, Mr. Chairman, I just suggest that you brief the council on the changes to the consultation document that have been made by the subcommittee this morning, so that the council actually has the up-to-date information.
Thank you.
That's acceptable.
All right. So we had that mover and seconder. Is there any other discussion on this report? If not, those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, carried. Thank you, members, for your time and discussion today. I'll declare the meeting closed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, everyone.